January 17th, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. The jungle breathed with moisture. In the pre-dawn darkness of central Luzon, beneath a canopy so thick that even moonlight struggled to penetrate, a column of American soldiers moved with practiced silence through knee-deep mud. Their boots made soft sucking sounds with each step, a rhythm that becomes familiar as their own heartbeats after months of island warfare. The air tasted of rotting vegetation and salt carried inland from the South China Sea. Staff Sergeant David Mitchell paused, his hand raised, and 30 men froze behind him like shadows suddenly made solid. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next ridge, lay something unprecedented in this brutal theater of war, a camp where their enemies lay dying, and where the rules of engagement would mean nothing at all. The Pacific War had taught American forces to expect fanaticism. Every island, every beachhead, every cave had been paid for in blood. Theirs and the enemy's. The Japanese soldier, as they had come to understand him, did not surrender. He charged into machine gun fire with bayonets fixed. He tied himself to palm trees with grenades clutched to his chest. He fought until death, or until his body simply could no longer obey his will. The concept of gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, had become doctrine, where death in battle was infinitely preferable to the shame of capture. By 1945, after nearly 4 years of island warfare, American forces had taken fewer than 5,000 Japanese prisoners across the entire Pacific theater, a staggering statistic when compared to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian soldiers who had surrendered in Europe and North Africa. The Japanese military had successfully cultivated a warrior spirit that viewed surrender as a betrayal not just of duty, but of one's very humanity. Yet ahead in that Luzon jungle camp, ideology and reality had collided with devastating force. The prisoners had been discovered 3 days earlier by Filipino guerrillas who had slipped through Japanese lines and made contact with the American advance units. Their report seemed almost impossible. Approximately 200 Japanese soldiers, many wounded or sick, abandoned by their retreating comrades, too weak to fight and too indoctrinated to surrender, waiting in their camp to die with whatever dignity starvation and disease would permit them. The guerrillas spoke of men who could barely lift their heads, who had consumed the last of their rice weeks ago and were now boiling leather boots and belts in desperate attempts to extract any nutritional value. Some had begun eating grass. Others had simply stopped eating altogether, lying on bamboo platforms in their tattered uniforms, preparing for death with the stoic acceptance their training had demanded. When the report reached Colonel James Whitaker at division headquarters, he faced a decision that fell outside any tactical manual. The strategic value of these prisoners was negligible. They were too sick to provide meaningful intelligence, too scattered across enemy territory to represent a significant force. The humanitarian argument was clearer, but complicated by the savage nature of the Pacific Campaign. These were soldiers of an army that had perpetrated the Bataan Death March, that had bayonet wounded Americans on beaches across the Pacific, that had systematically brutalized civilian populations from Nanking to Manila. Many of Whitaker's own men had seen friends die from sniper fire after attempting to offer medical aid to seemingly wounded Japanese soldiers who detonated hidden grenades. Truss had been murdered 1,000 times over on both sides. But Whitaker made his decision, and it was elegantly simple. They're prisoners of war, and we're going to treat them as such. Get them out. Sergeant Mitchell's unit had been selected because they were veterans, men whose nerves had been tempered by combat, who could be trusted to maintain discipline even in circumstances that might inflame younger soldiers. As they moved through the jungle that January morning, each man carried not just weapons but medical supplies, water purification tablets, and portable rations. They had been briefed to expect hostility, to prepare for suicide attacks, to watch for grenades hidden beneath bodies. The human mind, after all, struggles to separate the enemy from the ideology, the soldier from the system that created him. What they found instead would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives, not with horror, but with a strange, aching sadness. The camp materialized from the jungle mist like something from a fever dream. Crude shelters of bamboo and palm fronds sagged beneath the weight of accumulated rain. The smell reached them first, human waste, infection, and the sweet, sick odor gangrene. As Mitchell's men entered the clearing, weapons raised, figures began to stir in the shadows. What emerged were not the fierce warriors of propaganda posters, but skeletal apparitions in filthy uniforms. men whose eyes had already begun to acquire the glazed distance of the dying. Some attempted to stand at attention, an automatic response to military conditioning that their bodies could barely execute. Others simply watched with expressions that cycled between confusion, fear, and something that might have been relief. Private Robert Chun, a Nisei interpreter whose parents had been interned in California while he fought for his country in the Pacific, stepped forward and spoke in Japanese. His words were formal, careful. "The American Army is here. You are prisoners of war. We will provide medical care and food. You will not be harmed." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, impossibly, several of the Japanese soldiers began to weep. The ideological foundation upon which these men had built their entire understanding of warfare was crumbling before the evidence of their own senses. They had been taught that Americans were brutal savages, that capture meant torture and execution, that death in battle was the only honorable path. The military indoctrination manual issued to Japanese soldiers, the Senjinken, was explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid leaving behind a name of infamy. Yet here were their enemies, offering water to men too weak to hold a cup, radioing for medical evacuation for soldiers who had been trying to kill them days earlier, treating wounds with gentleness that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one they had been inhabiting. Corporal William Hayes, a medic from rural Kentucky, found himself kneeling beside a Japanese lieutenant whose legs had been shattered by American artillery. The officer's face was gray with pain and infection, his breathing shallow. Through the interpreter, Hayes explained that he would need to cut away the uniform to examine the wounds. The lieutenant nodded, then did something extraordinary. He apologized for the inconvenience. Hayes later recalled sitting back on his heels, momentarily overwhelmed by the absurdity and tragedy of the moment. "Here's this man," he would tell his grandchildren decades later, "apologizing to me while I'm about to dig shrapnel out his legs. It was the damnedest thing. Made me realize that under all the uniforms and flags, we were just boys who'd been told to kill each other." The medical supplies the Americans had brought were standard issue, but to the starving prisoners, they represented a kind of material abundance that their military had never been able to provide. While the Japanese military machine had poured resources into ships and aircraft, individual soldiers often went into battle with insufficient rations, inadequate medical supplies, and the expectation that they would live off captured enemy supplies. This structural neglect had been ideologically justified as fostering self-reliance and warrior spirit, but the reality was simpler. The Japanese military had overextended its supply lines and condemned its own soldiers to deprivation. Now, as American medics moved to the camp distributing sulfa drugs, morphine, and bandages that had been manufactured in factories operating at a scale Japan could no longer match, the material disparity became impossible to ignore. Point one of the prisoners, a former schoolteacher from Osaka named Takeshi Yamamoto, had kept a diary throughout his service. In entries written during his captivity, carefully hidden and only revealed years later, he described his shock at the casual abundance displayed by his captors. "They gave us chocolate," he wrote, "not as a special ration, but as if it were common. The medic treating my wounds threw away bandages after a single use. In our army, we would have washed and reused them until they fell apart. I began to understand why we were losing this war. It was not that their soldiers were braver. Ours had shown courage beyond measure. It was that their nation could afford to care for its soldiers, as if each individual life had value. We had been told this was weakness. Perhaps we had been told many things that were not true." The evacuation took 2 days. American medical units established a field hospital at the edge of the camp, performing emergency surgeries under canvas tarps while transport helicopters shuttled the most critical cases to rear area hospitals. The Japanese prisoners watched this operation with a kind of stunned disbelief. Several of the healthier prisoners insisted on helping to carry their more severely wounded comrades to the evacuation points, and American soldiers worked alongside them without apparent concern for the recent enmity between them. Private First Class Marcus Johnson from Detroit found himself on one end of a stretcher with a Japanese corporal on the other, both of them sweating and swearing in their respective languages as they navigated the muddy jungle path. At one point, the stretcher slipped, and both men caught it simultaneously, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared exhaustion that transcended any ideology. Not all of Mitchell's men embraced the mission with equanimity. Sergeant Thomas Brennan, who had carried a photograph of his dead brother, killed at Guadalcanal, in his helmet for 2 years, struggled visibly with providing aid to men he had been trained to kill. He sat apart from the others during rest periods, smoking cigarettes with mechanically steady hands, his jaw clenched. On the second day, as they prepared to evacuate the last of the prisoners, Brennan finally spoke to Mitchell. "I don't know if I can forgive them, sir," he said quietly, "for what they did to Billy, to all the others. But I guess that's not what we're here to do." Mitchell had no easy answer, because there wasn't one. War had created these moral tangles, and peace would not undo them. But he told Brennan what he believed. "We're not forgiving anything. We're just deciding what kind of men we're going to be." Among the items the American soldiers shared with their prisoners, one particular object became symbolic of the unbridgeable gap between the two military cultures: the sea ration. These compact meals, each containing a main course, crackers, candy, cigarettes, and accessories, represented the American military's commitment to ensuring that even frontline soldiers maintained caloric intake and morale. To the Japanese prisoners, who had often survived on rice and pickled vegetables even in the best circumstances, the sea rations were a revelation. Several prisoners carefully saved the empty tins, unable to comprehend a military that would package individual meals in metal containers that required a dedicated opener. The accessory pack, containing cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, and toilet paper, was particularly bewildering. One prisoner reportedly asked the interpreter whether these were special rations for officers. When told they were standard issue for every American soldier, he fell silent for several minutes before saying simply, "Then you have already won." The camp evacuation was completed without a single casualty on either side. The last helicopter lifted off on January 19th, carrying 3 Japanese soldiers who had been too weak to be moved earlier. As it rose above the jungle canopy, Sergeant Mitchell watched from the clearing below, aware that he had participated in something unusual in this war, an act of pure humanitarianism that offered no tactical advantage, claimed no territory, and advanced no strategic objective. In that moment, standing in the mud with his exhausted men around him, he felt a peculiar emotion that he would later struggle to articulate. Not pride exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that in a war of industrial slaughter and ideological extremism, there had been room for simple decency. The prisoners were processed through standard POW channels and eventually transferred to facilities in Hawaii and the continental United States. Their treatment there, adequate food, medical care, recreational facilities, and adherence to Geneva Convention standards, continued the cognitive dissonance that had begun in that Luzon jungle. Many would spend months in captivity before Japan's surrender in August 1945, and their testimonies about American treatment would later become part of the complex historical record of the war. Some returned to Japan after the war and never spoke of their experiences, the shame of surrender too deeply ingrained to overcome. Others became quiet advocates for reconciliation, their direct experience of American values in stark contrast to the propaganda they had been fed. Takeshi Yamamoto, the schoolteacher from Osaka, eventually published his diary in 1968, after years of silence. In the preface, he wrote, "We were taught that the Americans were beasts without culture or honor. Then they found us dying in the jungle and saved our lives for no reason except that they could. This single act of mercy taught me more about the nature of democracy than any political treatise. A nation that can afford to treat its enemies as human beings, even in the midst of war, is a nation that has discovered something essential about human dignity. We had been told that such mercy was weakness. We were wrong." The official U.S. Army record of the operation was brief, barely a paragraph in the division's after-action report. There were no medals awarded, no ceremonies held. It was considered simply part of the duty of soldiers who had been raised in a nation where the individual mattered, where the ideals enshrined in founding documents insisted that certain rights were inalienable regardless of the uniform one wore. The contrast with Japanese military culture, which had systematically devalued individual life in service of collective glory, could not have been starker. In the decades that followed, several of the American soldiers who participated in the evacuation maintained correspondence with their former enemies. These letters, careful and formal at first, gradually became more personal, Two sets of veterans try and make sense of what they had done to each other and for each other. One such exchange, between Corporal Hayes and a Japanese lieutenant whose legs he had saved, continued for 40 years. In his final letter before his death in 1987, the lieutenant wrote, "You gave me back my life when I expected only death. But more than that, you gave me back my humanity when I had forgotten I possessed it. I hope I have lived in a way that honored your kindness." The Luzon evacuation was not unique. American forces conducted similar humanitarian operations throughout the final months of the Pacific War, retrieving wounded Japanese soldiers from bypassed islands, treating prisoners with adherence to international law even when reciprocity had not been extended to American POWs. These actions were not widely publicized, partly because they complicated the necessary narrative of total war, partly because they were considered simply what was expected. But they represented something profound. A nation's values made concrete in the actions of exhausted soldiers who chose mercy, when vengeance would have been easier and perhaps more psychologically satisfying on a ridge above the abandoned camp. As the last helicopter disappeared into the overcast sky, Private Chin paused to look back at the clearing. He thought about his parents in the internment camp, about the suspicion he had faced from some of his fellow soldiers simply for sharing the same ancestry as the enemy, about the complex identity he navigated daily. And he thought about the Japanese soldiers they had just saved, men who would have killed him without hesitation on a battlefield, men who he had helped carry to safety. War revealed the worst of human nature, but sometimes, rarely, but powerfully, it revealed something else. The stubborn insistence that even in the midst of organized murder, individual acts of humanity could still occur. The jungle would quickly reclaim the camp. Within weeks, the shelters would collapse, the paths would disappear beneath new growth, and no physical evidence would remain of what had transpired there. But in the memories of the men who had been saved and the men who had saved them, January 17, 1945, would remain vivid, a moment when the ideology of total war had paused, when the abstraction of the enemy had become concrete individual humans in desperate need, and when a group of American soldiers had chosen to act not out of tactical necessity, but out of a value system that insisted on human dignity, even for those who had abandoned their own. This is what democracy looks like in its most essential form, not in speeches or declarations, but in the decision to treat suffering human beings as worthy of care regardless of what flag they serve. The Japanese soldiers in that jungle camp had expected to die as their training had prepared them to die, with stoic acceptance of their failure and abandonment. Instead, they lived, saved by men they had been taught to hate, and in living were forced to confront the possibility that everything they believed about their enemies, and perhaps about themselves, had been a carefully constructed ally in the vast machinery of the Second World War. This was the smallest of gears. A few dozen lives saved, no territory gained, no strategic advantage secured. Yet it represented something the Axis powers, with all their talk of glory and destiny and purification through violence, could never understand. That true strength lies not in the willingness to inflict suffering, but in the ability to prevent it, even when prevention serves no purpose beyond the affirmation of shared humanity. That is the gift of abundance and the burden of power, and the promise that made men like Sergeant Mitchell wade through jungle mud to save the lives of strangers who have killed them on any other day. That is what American soldiers carried with them, more vital than any weapon, more powerful than any ideology. The simple, revolutionary idea that every individual life possesses inherent worth, even in war, especially in war. And in a clearing in the Philippine jungle, as the rain began to fall again and the jungle closed back over the empty camp, that idea had proven itself stronger than the cult of death that had consumed an empire.